In 1187, the Christian presence in the Holy Land, born after the dramatic success of the First Crusade, which resulted in the Christian capture of Jerusalem, was now in serious danger. In the summer of that year, the Christians had suffered a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Hattin, which caused them untold damage. An account of that battle was given by the Sultan Saladin's young son, Al Afdal, who relates the capture of the king of Jerusalem. When the king of the Franks, Guy of Lusignan, was on the hill with his band of men, they made a formidable charge against the Muslims facing them, so that they drove them back to my father, Saladin. I looked towards him, and he was overcome by grief, and his complexion pale. He took hold of his beard, and advanced, crying out, "Give the lie to the devil." The Muslims rallied, returned to the fight, and climbed the hill. When I saw that the Franks had retreated, pursued by the Muslims, I shouted for joy. "We have beaten them." But the Franks rallied and charged again, like the first time, and drove the Muslims back to my father. He acted as he had done on the first occasion, and the Muslims turned upon the Franks and drove them back to the hill. I again shouted, "We have beaten them." But my father rounded on me and said, "Be quiet. We have not beaten them until that tent, guys, falls." As he was speaking to me, the tent fell. The Sultan dismounted, prostrated himself in thanks to God Almighty, and wept for joy. The Crusaders were now in dire straits, and soon the city of Jerusalem itself found itself besieged by Saladin's army. The siege began on the 20th of September 1187, and an account of it is given by an anonymous churchman who was inside the walls of Jerusalem at the time. Quite obviously, his words are of a particularly mournful tone. Terrifying shrieks and wails rang through the air, creating a dreadful din for the Holy City's Christian defenders. For 2 weeks, the walls of Jerusalem were pounded and arrows rained down. Indeed, so numerous were the arrows that it was said that no one could show a finger above the ramparts without being hit. There were tremendous casualties, and one of those wounded was the anonymous chronicler, who relates that he was struck on the bridge of his nose, with the wooden shaft being removed successfully by a physician, but the metal tip remaining where it struck him, even up until the time of him writing his account. Despite these dark and troubled times, the Christians resisted Saladin stubbornly, and for a time it looked like there may be hope on the horizon for them. Saladin had calculated that he was making little headway, and the time had come for a change of strategy. Almost a week into the siege, the Sultan identified a potentially vulnerable point in the city's defences, where he could potentially employ the use of his siege engines and ballistas, a catapult type weapon. After doing this, Saladin moved the position of his camp. For a short time, it looked to the Christians as though Saladin had given up and was retreating, and there were celebrations, but the joy was short lived. Saladin ordered his war machines to be moved up to the walls of Jerusalem under the protection of the rest of the army. Here, his men would begin a renewed and virtually relentless campaigns of bombardment. The shrieks continued anew. The huge stones resumed battering the walls, and Saladin even employed the use of Greek fire, which burned wood, stone, and everything it touches, in the words of the anonymous chronicler. The defence of the city continued to be stout, but on the 29th of September, a portion of a wall collapsed thanks to the efforts of Saladin's miners, leaving the Christians increasingly vulnerable and exposed, but still their resistance continued. However, it was becoming obvious to those inside the city that Jerusalem's fall was now inevitable, and terms were sought with Saladin in order to avoid a bloodshed. The Christians, led by Balian of Ibelin, entered negotiations with the Sultan, and eventually an agreement was reached, the terms of which was read out to the citizens of Jerusalem on the 2nd of October. Understandably, it was met with widespread grief. The anonymous chronicler writes, "But, alas, by the hands of wicked Christians, Jerusalem was turned over to the wicked. The gates were closed and guards were posted. Our people held the city of Jerusalem some 89 years. Within a short time, Saladin had conquered almost the whole kingdom of Jerusalem." There would be a response in the West. Christian Europe had been rocked by the Battle of Hattin, and this latest conquest by Saladin was nothing more than a tragedy for them. These events would give birth to the Third Crusade and one of the great rivalries of the medieval period. Even after taking Jerusalem, the mighty Saladin continued in his search for further conquest. On the horizon, however, in the not too distant future, lurked the spectre of a man who would not only challenge Saladin, but put a halt to the Sultan's seemingly relentless march. At the time of the fall of Jerusalem, this man was not yet even a king, merely a prince who was at odds with his father, King Henry II of England. Henry himself would promise to take up the cross, but would never make it. Instead, it would be his rebellious son, Prince Richard, who would become a Crusader. Soon after becoming King of England in 1189, Richard set about gathering finances for what would be a very costly venture indeed. Although his methods for raising money were considered slightly heavy handed at the time and caused some disgruntlement across the country, Richard was not to be put off. It was this hard headed approach that would see him earn the nickname the Lionheart and become feared by Muslims everywhere. But could Richard the Lionheart retake Jerusalem?